Good evening. My name's Toby Greeney. I'm head of the London Centre for Leadership and Learning here at the Institute, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the London Centre's annual lecture. Russell's just made the obvious joke, how many professors does it take to get a memory stick to work? And you've seen us sweating at the front here, but it is now working. This time last year, I was the one giving the annual lecture, so I have to say I'm a lot more relaxed this year knowing that Robert's going to be doing it. It's good to see lots of friends of LCLL here. For those of you that don't know us and don't know the London Centre, we're a department of the IOE, which is now a school within UCL. We merged in December with UCL, and so far all's going smoothly with that. So LCLL, we're now, I think, the largest higher education leadership centre in the country. We focus our research work around three broad areas: system reform, leadership and leadership development, and increasingly knowledge mobilisation. So how does evidence and practice move between practitioners, within schools, between schools? And those are our kind of broad research interests. We have a suite of master's programmes covering educational leadership, inspection and accountability and evaluation, as well as an MBA, an international MBA in educational leadership. We also have a large CPD programme, a key part of which is our partnership with a group of teaching schools and other schools across London, the South East and the Eastern region, where we're licensed by the National College and working with about 2,600 or so school leaders on national professional qualification for headship and the other leadership programmes. We also do lots in partnership with schools, with local authorities, with academy trusts and so on, which I won't go into the detail of. So if you're not involved, please do talk to us, get involved, become a member of LCLL, which gives you access to all these events and so on. In terms of this evening, Robert's going to talk for about half an hour or so, and then we'll hear responses from the panel members. I'll introduce the panel at that point, and then we'll have time for question and debate following that. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Robert. Many of you will know him. I've worked with Robert for the past 8-9 years or so. He's led on a number of really important research studies around this whole area of the self-improving system, academy chains and so on, and many of you will have drawn on and used that work. Prior to becoming an independent education consultant, Robert was an advisor in government. He was advisor to Tony Blair, to Charles Clarke when he was Secretary of State for Education. And prior to that, he was at the Audit Commission and has undertaken a range of different research and analytical roles. So he's very immersed in this whole picture and understands the policy context as well, and is very well placed to talk about the next 5 years for school leaders and leadership. Robert.
Thank you. Thank you for that welcome. There's a range of mountains in the Canadian Rockies called the Valley of the 10 Peaks. Each of the peaks is over 10,000 feet high, and they say that it's a good place to go, to use the American term, if you like hiking. It's a tough call getting up and down each of those peaks. And that's in some ways a metaphor that I want to use this evening, because the first part of what I want to share with you is 10 challenges which I think the school system faces over the next 10 years, and then I'm going to go on to look at the opportunities that there also are. The first 3 or 4 challenges I think will be very familiar and well understood by many of you because you are grappling already with them. The rise in pupil numbers. By 2020, we're going to have around 650,000 extra pupils in the school system. The bulge and the surge which we've seen in primary will continue, but will also start to feed through into secondary. It will affect some parts of the country more than others, and we know what a struggle. I live in Surrey, an area that is working really hard and struggling to find sufficient places for every child. Theoretically, 250,000 of the new places are going to come from free schools. So we are told, although when you listen and read what the Secretary of State is saying, she still hankers after creating some surplus places to facilitate choice in relation to schools in areas where it is perceived there isn't sufficient choice. Although quite how we can afford to create surplus capacity in a time when funding is going to be very constrained is, I think, going to be a good question. It seems to me also there's going to be a big strategic challenge for local authorities, because as well as the challenge of 650,000 extra places, making that fit with new free school provision, we also have the policy that is going to come on stream that a number of governments have theoretically espoused and implemented of popular schools, including free schools and grammar schools being able to expand. So creating a viable strategy in each locality, I don't think is going to be easy, and it's going to be a significant challenge. There's an additional challenge around this for the early years. I mean, frankly, it is those of us who are familiar. I did quite a lot of work with the department around its early year strategies when it was moving from 12.5 hours to 15 hours. And it really struggled to create the extra capacity, notwithstanding the fact that it's not just schools, it's the private sector and the voluntary sector that is part of the provision. To double that to 30, I mean, where those places and those people and those staff are going to come from, it seems to me is a very remarkable challenge indeed, and good luck to them in making that work over the next few years. The next one, again, you will be dealing with probably, if not on a day-to-day, certainly a week-to-week basis, I suspect, and a term-to-term basis. Stories and surveys are becoming ever more frequent about the problem that schools are having recruiting sufficient teachers of quality and calibre. Over the past 3 years, 6,000 fewer teachers have been trained than the government had planned for, and the number of applicants holding an offer at the end of April 2015, just the end of last month, was down by 3,300 compared with the year before. When we look at it by subject, we see that maths, physics and modern foreign languages are among the subjects where there are particular recruitment pressures. And this throws into sharp relief the government's pledge to train an extra 17,500 maths and physics teachers. The challenge also extends to the fact that questions remain about the coherence and effectiveness of the different pathways into teaching. We also have the challenge that we know historically that it is most difficult to recruit teachers at the time when the economy is moving into an upward cycle. And because wages become uncompetitive, or partly because wages become uncompetitive. If I was still an advisor to a Secretary of State, I would be flagging this up with all the red traffic lights glowing as to a big risk, because it seems to me the government has taken central control of this. The government has dismantled essentially the controls it had for planning supply to a large extent, and it seems to me that if the challenge becomes a crisis, the buck will very firmly sit on the Secretary of State's desk. There's also the issue that some cynics will say that the government will use the crisis and use the shortages to encourage a greater use of unqualified teachers. Challenge 3, growing the leadership pipeline. We have an ageing profile in terms of our school leaders. Around 10,000 heads, deputies and assistant heads are aged 55 and over. So somewhere between the next 5-10 years, we've got a lot of people to replace. We know that replacing primary heads and the vacancies is a problem, and a lot have to be re-advertised. The problem, let's just be diplomatic about this, the problem is not going to get any easier of getting people to come forward with a new RI sanction regime that about which over the last weekend there has been so much prominence. And I think that's going to be a very considerable problem. Big uncertainties about the licensing model for middle, senior, MPQH leadership, whether that will continue. And if so, what will replace it? And in almost, as it were, an acknowledgement of the problem of finding enough and sufficient good head teachers, again, although we're moving to a school-led system, the government's response has been to step in directly and to commission future leaders to start to provide heads for some of the areas that they need them. But that is not, it seems to me, a solution that can be scaled up to have national application. Funding constraints. In some ways, this is where the outcome of the election has simplified things, because we know at least what the manifesto said in relation to this. There is a commitment to protect cash spending per pupil, and that means in government there are two terms used. You either make adjustments on a cash basis or on a real terms basis, and real terms means that you allow for inflation. So protecting spending per pupil on a cash basis means there is no allowance for inflation built in for the first 4 years, certainly, although they are allowing for the extra pupils that come into the system. So there is funding to allow for that. The IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, estimates that that's a cut to school spending per head of around 7%. Rises to 9% when, as you know, you're grappling with your budgets, the national insurance rises and the pension increases come into play. And the IFS has then factored in what happens when pay comes into the equation, and therefore, in reality, we're probably looking at reductions of about 12%. The pupil premium is protected at current rates, but early years and 16 to 19 are not included in protection. But in practice, they'll have to do something about early years because the providers won't provide the places because already they're operating at cost or just below in some cases. So there will be a real pressure on that one as well. Challenge 5, if we haven't got enough challenges, is it the biggest? It's your judgment. I mean, certainly it seems to me just about every child, every pupil in the system is going to be affected by curriculum change over the next 5 years. I'm not going to go through all these. You know it. You are, as it were, working on it. You are implementing it. You are planning for it. You are doing it. The new bits in the system are the resits for those not meeting level 4 at Key Stage 2. But the rest of it is pretty much there. It's put in place and it will roll out. Whether in retrospect we will see it almost as big a change as the 1944 changes were addressed to the curriculum, or certainly what was done in 1992, I suspect it will come to be seen of that. And the significance, it seems to me, is that, there's the quote in red there, is that this was, I did some work with the group that were looking at King's at the impacts of changes made in science around about, I think it was the 2008 changes that were made. And many of the teachers in our study were still developing their classroom enactment of the new curriculum at least 4 to 5 years after the introduction of the reform. It takes a long time for curriculum change to really bed down, to bed in, to have the impact. Therefore, it seems to me, the good news from this must be that this surely must constrain the ability of ministers and anyone else to make further curriculum change during this period. Linked to that, we have a whole raft of accountability measures, again, most of them known. Commission on Life Beyond Levels. We have to wait and see what that will come to. We know the shape of most things. It seems to me that the Progress 8 measure has become more rather than less contentious as the detail has rolled out. If you've been reading your blogs, big concerns about the equivalence of the lower grades in GCSE during the period when the changeover is happening to the new grading system. There are all sorts of statistical arguments, disputes going on about fine grading and the reliance and reducing schools' performance down to one score. And therefore I think that what a lot of people felt was a good system, maybe undermined by some of the detail. There is certainly still, in the intervening year, and now a bias in the system towards concentrating still on people on the top grades. So we may debate that. And we see some of the other things. The other big thing that it seems to me, if you're cynical and you're in the conspiracy theorist, you can argue is deliberate. I don't think it is deliberate. I think it is something that actually has not been sufficiently thought about, is that the discontinuity will make actually tracking what is happening in the English education system very, very difficult, to the extent to see whether we are improving or not in the same way. And I think that is something that will be a disadvantage. If we come to core business, the latest information from the OECD suggests that the overall performance of schools in England is average or just above compared with other jurisdictions. We are certainly not world beaters. So the challenge to improve outcomes will continue, particularly for disadvantaged students. That shows you how we are doing or not doing terribly well on closing gaps in attainment between free school meals and other pupils. And it seems to me that the challenge is going to be intensified, obviously by some of the curriculum changes, because again our experience and the evidence shows that it is those at the bottom of the pile who tend to initially miss out from curriculum change, either they are intended to be the beneficiaries of it, but also because child poverty is set to get worse in the period up to 2020. The government is almost certainly on target to miss its targets, and that is before we have seen the latest or what will be the next set of welfare reform changes. And the correlation between deprivation and attainment, it seems to see, is so well attested. It does not provide an alibi, it does not provide an excuse, but to expect the school system to carry the whole weight of closing the gap and improving social mobility, you have to wonder whether there is a systemic challenge that schools by themselves will be able to manage. Where will we be in 5 years? Will that gap be very significantly closer? I think there are a lot of people who would have big question marks on whether that's likely to happen. Challenge 8 is ironic, given the problems we had with our PCs as we started. But we know the way that technological change, the pace at which it grows. And schools vary enormously in the extent to which they are harnessing technology to use learning. This shows you every August Ofcom publishes, I'm a bit of a nerd on this, a fascinating set of reports that looks at how both adult and children's are using technologies and different types of technology. It ought to be probably compulsory reading from somebody in your leadership team over the summer holidays. And it shows that we hit our peak confidence and understanding of digital communications technology when we are in our mid-teens. So not much hope for me, or for a lot of us here this evening. And it seems there's surely challenges as to enable and empower students to co-design with teachers in a disciplined way, not in a way that is loose, how they learn and how they acquire knowledge. It may not seem, it seems to me, such a pressing challenge, but it's surely the sort of issue that our pedagogical leaders should be focusing on. We're also, I don't think, making nearly as much use of technology as we should be doing in supporting teacher development. Challenge 9 is mission creep. I was at a session that Dame Sue John was speaking at, and she had a picture of the medieval church on the screen, because the church didn't just hear your penance and give you absolution, it fed you in the land surrounding the church very often. It provided education, it provided housing. And it's a bit like that with schools. The last government, or the coalition government, started in 2010, and every child matters went out the window. We're going to focus on your core job, teaching and learning. The Ofsted inspection framework was stripped back. But now, a whole new range of expectations have come on schools, keeping children safe, preventing sexual exploitation, reducing obesity, ensuring mental well-being, promoting British values, developing personal and employment skills, as well as getting qualifications. And we heard talk before the election about providing childcare. So I think school leaders might be confused could be forgiven for being confused about the scope of their role. And I think that quite a lot of this comes back to whether we do have a shared sense about what the education system is for. How do we get a balance between a utilitarian approach that provides a trained workforce for our economy on the one hand, and sees education as a good in its own right? How do we get a balance between developing young people with the skills to go to university or apprenticeships, but also ensure they have skills for life? These are things that certainly when ASCA was doing the blueprint, it started to ventilate and debate, and we need more of that. And the final challenge is maturing the self-improving system. The rhetoric's all about schools and school leaders being in the driving seat in leading improvement, but the government's manifesto actually involves more powers going to agents of the central state and more policies, such as resits, being determined by ministers. And the role of school leaders sits alongside, and system leaders sits alongside, those who have responsibilities such as local authorities and regional schools commissioners and teaching schools councils. So we have different roles being exercised by various players in different parts of the country in different ways. Despite, again, some of the rhetoric, I think in many parts of the country, outside London and even in parts of London, but certainly outside London, local authorities are still playing quite a significant role. And a lot of primaries will still look to them for support. The Conservative government's instinct, as we have seen, is to create more academies, although interestingly their own evidence that came out just again before the election, it was one of the last consultations they published, showed that if we look at the distribution of performance of schools in academy chains and local authorities, the distribution is not that different. We have some high-performing academy chains and high-performing schools in local authorities, and equally we have some down at the bottom, and a range clustered, as you can see, in the middle there. So this is a fairly daunting set of challenges, and I haven't even mentioned things like creating a high-quality career service or things like such as a fragmented admission systems. So now by this point you may be feeling some sense of foreboding about the years that are come, but I want to then move to a more optimistic thought. It's best to hike as a group. And my argument here this evening is that I think there is the opportunity for school leaders could over the next 5 years exercise collaborative leadership to remodel how we train teachers, redefine professional development, recast leadership of learning, and the other things I've got on that slide. I'm going to talk a bit about each of those, but only if collaboration is organised to reflect the disciplines of effective partnership. And again, I'm going to talk about the disciplines that we need to address. That collaboration is not a soft option, but is a hard taskmaster. So let's see the opportunities if we collaborate. This is collaboration at both a local and at, if you like, a system level. I think there's an opportunity to remodel how we train teacher training. We had the Carter Review, and now Stephen Monday is working on putting those recommendations. My view is that we need to reimagine the first 3 years of a teacher's career, the training year, the NQT year, and the NQT plus 1 year, and to make it of a much more integrated whole, rather than trying to cram all the theoretical learning into sort of 1 year and also try and fit in classroom skills. We need to, as it were, pace it over 3 years. Yes, I think we'd keep still to the model where teachers, as it were, would have an employment at the end of the first year. But certainly I see no reason why we shouldn't still continue, perhaps with placements across schools, continuing into years 2 and 3 as part of their learning, and with NQT status being awarded at the end of year 3, rather than the end of year 1, with certainly a hefty set of credits towards a master's along the way. And that I think that would be delivered by HEIs and schools working together in consortia, probably at a sub-regional level, so that we don't see, as we're having to see, either MATS and sometimes Teaching School Alliance competing constantly to try and grab the best recruits. We also need to see, I would suggest, a rationalisation of the routes into teaching as well. The second one, and I think this is the one I feel most passionately about more than anything else, is that there is an opportunity to redefine professional development. Learning from, if we go back and we see where we've come from, the improving teacher style programs, the growth of coaching that we now have in the system, the action research focus of many teaching school alliances, it's shown the power of combining formal learning with modelling, analysing and improving practice in the classroom. That combination, I think we need to ensure that it becomes the universal professional development template for the future. Teachers within and across schools would draw on what they would know through masters, through masterclasses, online research, through inset sessions, reading groups. I love it when I go into a school and I have a reading group for staff. And they then work together to improve teaching in the classroom through peer coaching, action research, lesson study, and so forth. They would obviously be looking to assess the impact of their work, and here I'm an unashamed disciple of size effect and what John Hattie teaches and proclaims, as well as, I can see Kevin's here tonight, I think randomised controlled trials also have a role to play as well. And to give you two brief examples, in the Park Federation in West London that I work with, they are identifying across 6 academies this year the key challenges in years 3 and 4 presented by the new national curriculum around age-related expectations in maths. How have these challenges been addressed in planning, teaching, marking and general assessment? Which of these approaches have proved more effective? They're then going to create some hypotheses which they'll work together with a lead practitioner from each academy of their 6 academies during 2016 and look and evaluate the impact with a view to establishing their practice as an academy group. Or I think of the work, and I didn't know they were going to be here, I did with the Eleanor Palmer Primary School and their Teaching School Alliance, which provided an expert input on developing mathematical fluency and reasoning through problem solving. They had, if you like, master input at the start of the academic year, and then they used their SLEs throughout the year to work with staff around implementation and modelling and coaching and ensuring that they had curriculum leaders who were skilled to work with the rest of the staff. It's this approach, it's this slide, this should be the mandate for the College of Teaching. If the College of Teaching is not about this, then I don't know what it's for. I then think we then need to recast leadership of learning. Oh, sorry, before we do that, I've got one more, I see. We need to develop school-led improvement across the system. This is a slide I borrowed from George Berwick, because I think what we're doing with our professional development provides, this is his point, it provides the engine for schools to grow and move together and for their collaboration to get really, really deep. I like that slide. So, you know, it's the stages that we go through. We don't grow to deep partnership working overnight. It takes time. And what are the drivers of that depth? It is his research, it is then working with the best practice and drawing on effective emerging innovation. We need to recast leadership of learning. Leading learning within schools, leading learning between schools, which is happening in our chains, in our MATs, in our Teaching School Alliance, in our federations, and in our clusters, and leading learning across the system. Again, nothing very new there that we don't already know, but we need to, as it were, see this as the norm, and we have a big communications challenge to explain this to policymakers, to those in the media opinion formers, and to parents, that headship of a school is only one dimension of what school leadership now means if we are to see our whole system move forward together. We need to move and build a leadership pipeline, using school groups as the basis for deploying school leaders to different leadership assignments as a way of accelerating their development. Supported, I was pleased to see the plans that are now, the ideas that are being cast around for a sector-led education system, which it seems to me should be a priority to take over from what is now a sadly enfeebled national college. We need to use resources more productively. We know that collaboration provides the basis for sharing posts, sharing services, joint procurement, integrated financial management, centralised data analysis, and so forth. Groups of schools have the expertise to employ high-level financial and business management expertise to help them plan their budgets. Schools, in my view, will have no claim to whinge about funding levels until they are working together to extract maximum value in this way from the resources that they already have. So, the next 5 years offer big, exciting opportunities of development, but we need the disciplines of effective partnership. The John West-Burnham point, we need to understand scale, and we need to put that alongside understanding the work that we need to do as schools in small clusters, often 3, 4, 5 schools, probably no more, and then understand what we're going to do at scale more in our multi-academy trust or our teaching school alliance or wherever we look to for broader support. So we'll do the intensive, perhaps teacher-to-teacher work and development and coaching on a school-to-school basis, but we might run some of our leadership programs and some of our curriculum programs on a broader cross-partnership or MAT basis. We need to espouse strong and clear and tiered governance with good people who we support, and we mustn't run away from there being hard accountability within our partnerships. MATs are already there and understanding that, or most of them should be. They've got the structures for it, and maybe that is something where teaching school alliances will need to develop greater effectiveness. Although, again, this is not my phrase. I borrowed this from a recent blog, though I've been talking about it. We need to balance, if you like, what I call the hard and soft elements of working together in a collaborative fashion. The hard elements are around governance, executive leadership, around the organisation of our support functions. The softer bits, what I call the flowy bits, are to do with our school improvement models and how we engage and use joint practice development and leadership development to move our learning around our schools. And therefore, arguably, teaching school alliances are very strong on the networking bit. MATs tend to be strong on the hierarchy bit. The best MATs get the balance between the two, and that's what we need to do to have an effective collaboration. We need to get this balance between hierarchy and networking. We need all schools to be part, if collaboration is to be the driver, we need all schools to be part of an effective school improvement group. So I would see it is not something we can have by diktat, it's an expectation that we need to move and steer schools in this direction. We may be lacking in some of our school groups to start with strong school improvement skills, and therefore they will need support, they will need nurturing. I think that schools on the whole should be able to choose their partners, but there will be, perhaps it's choice within bounds. We may move to sorts of systems that they may have in New York over time, where, if you like, school improvement groups are accredited, and you can belong to any of the groups, as it were, but from an approved list. Who knows? What we need to ensure is that no school gets left out or left behind. And that brings me to this. Some will interpret a self-improving system as implying there's no need for local authorities or even regional schools commissioners. That is naive and at variance with how things tend to work in high-performing education systems. We need to ensure that there is a shared vision for improving education in each area, that every child has a school place, that the needs of vulnerable children are taken care of, that schools are challenged to work together effectively, that weak or declining performance is spotted quickly and corrected, that data and knowledge is being moved around across school, and there is accountability to local communities. Places such as Wigan and Bradford and Birmingham are in various stages of developing systems that do this. I think in a self-improving system, the issue is not whether there is a middle tier. I'm sorry, local authorities may be going, but look, local authorities are dead long-lived regional schools commissioners. In a self-improving system, the issue is not the existence of some form of middle tier, but creating the right culture to make it successful by employing leaders with high-level skills and working with school leaders to carry out many of its roles. It may look different in different parts of the country. So, the scenario we should be moving to, I would suggest, is this. Schools already increasingly working in hard clusters led by executive leaders as part of a MAT or Teaching School Alliance or broader school network that focus on improving teaching and learning, as part of a sub-region that coordinates pupil places, recruitment, training, teachers and development. And in some cases, particularly perhaps coastal areas and other areas of deprivation, the deployment of teachers and oversees school progress. I think if we do that, there is a rich harvest that collaboration could yield. Again, not to go through those points, I think they're self-evident. The final, perhaps, choice, challenge, is perhaps the largest one facing us. Are school leaders confident enough to drive this agenda? Or will school leaders be passive and wait to be told what to do? Are school leaders sufficiently committed to working with each other to improve the system? Or will the impact of funding cuts make them want to grab pupils for themselves? Will the temptation to expand their school numbers, school roll, mean that in fact we're back to the dog-eat-dog days that undermine collaboration? Will some of the MATs and other school groups retreat into what I call their baronies rather than share their knowledge? Only by collaborating in a strategic and rigorous way, only by doing that, in my view, lies the route to the professional trust and autonomy that so many in this room tonight yearn to see. So that is my pitch as to why they're really, if that is what you want, if you want that recognition, if you want ministers and others to listen, really the salvation is in your own hands. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much for that sweeping, fantastic overview of both challenges and opportunities for leaders over the next 5 years. I want now to introduce the panel and ask them to just give their responses before we go into the question and answer session. So moving down from Robert's left, I'm going to introduce all four of you and then pass over to you, if that's okay. Sian Carr, a former colleague of mine from the National College for School Leadership, but over the last 6 years has been principal of Skinner's Kent Academy in Tunbridge Wells in Kent, where I've been down a couple of times and seen both the school as was and the school as is, and it's been a fantastic transformation over that period of a fascinating journey you've been on. Before being at the National College, Sian was a head in Essex and also led the Eastern Leadership Centre. Russell Hobby, you will all know as General Secretary of NEHT, the National Association of Head Teachers, the largest union for school leaders in the UK. I didn't mention, of course, that Sian is also here representing ASCL, the Association of School and College Leaders, where she is chair of the Professional and Leadership and Governance Committees, but also vice chair, meaning that she will become president next year? The year after next. Passing back to Russell then, General Secretary of NEHT, and before you went there in 2010, wasn't it? Russell worked for the Hay Group, where he did lots of fascinating work around leadership development, which was how we first met. Has lots of other roles as well, on the boards of the Brilliant Club, Teaching Leaders, the Teacher Development Trust, member of the advisory board of Future Leaders as well. Sir Dan Moynihan, Chief Executive of the Harris Federation, which it says here has 36 primary and secondary schools. Is that right at the minute, Dan? Yes, 36. And, you know, one of the most impressive academy chains, I think, across London. All of the secondary academies in the chain have been inspected and found to be good or outstanding, despite starting from a significantly lower place. 75% of them graded outstanding. Dan's very much led that effort. Before that, he was a head of 2 schools in London, and so has a wealth of experience in some of the challenges Robert was talking about. And finally, Chris Husbands, Director of the Institute of Education, and also now Vice Provost Academic Development and London across UCL, has a rich background in academia, but also as a teacher and school leader. So, Sian, shall we start with your reflections on Robert's input first?
Thank you. I think Robert sets out very clearly for us a 10-peak challenge. Each peak requires solutions to be shaped within a context, as he's clearly set out, of continued austerity in terms of educational funding, and a system which is more complex and diverse than it has ever been before. We also know there is a shortage of high-quality teachers and leaders, alongside the implementation of generational curriculum, assessment and qualification reform. And I believe these are challenges which cannot be met in isolation. We have to work together, we have to connect the pieces together, and we have to lead the way. The ASCL Blueprint, which was endorsed by Nicky Morgan and by Sir Michael Barber at the National Conference of ASCL in March, sets out clearly a vision of a future education system which is self-improving and school-led. And Nicky Morgan actually said in her speech to the conference, at the heart of our plan for education is our commitment to supporting schools to be in the driving seat of school improvement and professional development, working together to spread best practice, knowledge and experience. It's a great quote. So the vision that is set out so clearly in that blueprint has to be, in my view, enabled and enacted. It is not enough for it to be an interesting and praiseworthy document. Robert also talks about collaborative leadership, and Steve Mumby also has spoken before about courageous leadership. And it seems to me that both are needed going forward. However, I think that we should also consider the concept of connected leadership, which utilises our values and behaviours to connect with each other as a way in which we can mobilise the system to meet Robert's 10-peak challenge. Collaborative leadership could indeed yield a rich harvest, but I believe that leadership will need to be connected as well if school leaders are going to be confident enough to drive the agenda and indeed willing to work together to improve the system. 2 key questions at the end of Robert's presentation. Connected leadership starts by managing complexity and ambiguity and building trust. It works at a number of levels in the system, and it focuses not just on the single collaboration or partnership, but is multiple, highly networked and complex. It includes collaboration, but is a stage beyond it. Connected leaders look out at the wider system, beyond the local, the regional, and indeed national. They forge multiple systemic relationships which are rooted in shared values and moral purpose. Our horizons must be wider than those of the single collaboration or partnership that we have forged. So 4 key areas that I would outline, indeed Michael Fullan has recently outlined, reveal where we could perhaps use connected leadership to mobilise the system. Building teacher professionalism, how we use our connected leadership to build up the professional practice of teachers and leaders through connecting them to each other and creating powerful professional learning environments and networks. And I believe the use of new technologies will play a significant role in achieving this. Building pedagogy. We have an opportunity to seize the agenda as we adjust to a world without levels and the changing demands of the curriculum, and to build deep and structural practice which is tied to assessment of learning and improvement of learning. We need to connect, in my opinion, primary and secondary practice, and structural reform gives us a very real opportunity to do this. Third one, building social capital. We need those educating as well as those being educated to be strong as a group, not just as individuals. We need to create learning environments that give young people a strong sense of their place in the world, of the possibility and potential of that world and their contribution to it, and how they can connect with it. Fourth, building an understanding of the system. We need to move teachers and leaders beyond their own classroom and school into a broader professional space where we connect with each other, act in concert beyond the interests of our individual institutions, and collectively own the outcomes of the system. Connected leadership is inclusive of, but I believe more powerful than collaboration or collaborative leadership or courageous leadership. Understanding our connectedness to each other is the beginning, potentially, of a renewed narrative of social justice. Collaboration only gets us so far. We can collaborate and still not understand our role in system improvement. It is for the profession to provide a strong and connected response to these challenges. I think it's a moment in time to create the system we want and to lead that system.
I've got two microphones. Thank you very much. If I'm brutally frank, I've had a grumpy couple of weeks in terms of what's happened, and the papers on Sunday and the television programmes didn't really help on that one in terms of the threats that are being made to Require's improvement schools. But I've just about managed to convince myself, and I think Robert's presentation has really helped on that one, that if we play our cards right, the next 5 years could be a fantastic set of years for the profession. And it's not because those challenges aren't real on funding, on recruitment, on the number of pupil places coming into the system, but it's because there isn't one of those challenges that can be met without working with the profession. And when I read the Conservative manifesto for 2015, it could quite easily have been written for 2010 as well. There's a strong continuation of policies within there that we're working hard on the levers of high-stakes accountability and autonomy. But we've worked on those levers over the last 5 years, almost to the point of destruction. The challenges that we face, the battle that we're fighting to come, are all issues of capacity. And capacity issues such as the supply of quality teachers and the supply of quality leaders are not easily met from the centre of the system. They can only be worked on by government and the profession itself taking up these challenges. So there is a risk that the government's strategy risks fighting the last war when the future battles are very different. But as a profession ourselves, we also need to make sure we are fighting the battles of the future too. It's not returning to the debate on academies and free schools, but looking at how we can add capacity building into a mix of autonomy and accountability at the same time. So that rather than having an education system built on 2 pillars, we have one built on 3 pillars. And I think we need to keep emphasising those points. And that gives us substantial leverage to build the partnerships and to moderate what happens. And indeed, as an example in point, if you look at the detail on the announcement of coasting schools, it is a lot less bullish than it might appear at first glance. It's not all RI schools. It's not always forced academisation. There is a continuum of interventions that might go on there. Because the government itself realises that it doesn't have 3,000 additional school leaders waiting to step up and take on these positions. It doesn't have enough NLEs, executive heads and system leaders to work in the coaching scenario. So I think we can work together on these things, not by digging our heels in, but by painting a suitable alternative vision. A couple of those points that Richard outlined that I'd like to pick up on. The first is the issue of schools working in groups. I think as a profession we should set ourselves, and indeed NEHT has set itself, the goal of making sure that every school is in a strong and substantive group of schools. But I don't think we should get hung up on the label of MAT or Academy Trust. I think those will be part of the solution, but I think there are other strong and purposeful ways of working together. I don't think it should be head teacher coffee mornings. I don't think it's about getting round on a Friday morning to complain about how awful the system is. We have to be mutually accountable to each other. But there's a danger that some of the Academy brand has been tainted, particularly for primary schools. And what I think the mistake the government made over the last 5 years is that it gave autonomy and hoped that people would collaborate. What it should have done was the other way round, was get people to collaborate, and then they will demand autonomy and freedom when they have the capacity to deliver on that. I also agree about the issue of leadership development. One of the saddest things over the last 5 years, I believe, has been the decline of the National College. And if you're going to ask greater demands of people, you also have to invest in them equally at the same time. And I don't think we have to wait around for the government to solve this one. I think it should be within the hands of the profession to take ownership of its leadership qualifications and its leadership development and to provide that as an alternative. I have high hopes for the College of Teaching as set out in there, but I think we must be careful not to kill the College of Teaching with kindness. I think one of the worst things that could happen to it would be for it to convert straight into an establishment body with lots of standards and bureaucracies and systems. I think it has to fight for its right to represent teachers by being bold on the evidence and by being to challenge both the profession and politicians themselves. And I'm worried that we might have given it too easy a start on this, which I guess is a somewhat perverse view on that one. And then the one thing not mentioned was the issue of inspection and what role that could play within here. I suspect it's not been mentioned because we're all assuming now that Ofsted is due for radical reform, and I think that is the case. But the direction of that reform could go in many different directions, from a heavily data-driven approach to a peer review system. But if we do want leaders to feel genuinely empowered, we do need a different approach to inspection, because in many ways, over the last 5 years, it is not authority that's been delegated to school leaders, but authority that's been delegated to the Chief Inspector of Schools. And we need to hold schools accountable for their outputs and outcomes in a very rigorous and challenging fashion, but they're still being held increasingly accountable for the methods and approaches through which they deliver that. But I am optimistic because of that, because this is not 2010. The battles for the next 5 years are different, and they will have to be sought by collaboration, and I think we're ready to step up for that. Thank you.
Thank you. As someone not representing a national professional association and someone running schools, what I thought I'd do is talk about collaboration in a very practical and grounded sense and give some examples of the benefits that could bring, because I agree with what Robert has said, that collaboration and schools working together with certain caveats is the answer. And there's no question in my mind that in an age of austerity, in order to avoid disaster, things have to be done differently. And school groups can act smartly so that their whole is more than the sum of the parts. Because if you do what you always do, at best you get what you always get. But to do better in the face of this challenge, we really do need to do things differently. And if we don't, we'll all end up being told what to do by people less qualified than us to make those decisions. So it's there for us to grab. And I've said school groupings can, rather than will, act smartly, because of course there's nothing inherent in a group arrangement that will definitely add value to schools. There's nothing inherent in a collaboration that adds value to outcomes, if that collaboration is not about the things that make a difference, sometimes really uncomfortable things. And if collaboration replaces a focus on these key issues. I know of more than one school grouping where their heads value their complete autonomy above what is best for the alleged grouping that they claim to be a part of. And so they refuse to cede any power at all to a group-wide governing council. And as a result, they don't gain the benefits that they should. And in such arrangements, if a school gets into difficulty, no one has the grip to help if the school can't do it itself, or if it can't recognise the need or the urgency. And those kinds of arrangements are clearly not the arrangements that we're talking about here. The benefits of effective collaboration, however it's done, include some really mundane things. And forgive me for talking a bit about how it's not because it's an academy group, just because it's a group of schools doing stuff that any group of schools can and does do. But there's mundane stuff like back office advantages. So last year, our schools group saved around 2 million in economies of scale, which went straight back into schools' budgets. And we just did some really boring stuff that involved a group of heads collaborating and agreeing to do things. So we have a team of central bursars, qualified accountants who manage 3 schools each. They save each school tens of thousands on avoiding employing a bursar for themselves. We employ high-level network managers, better than any one school could afford. They manage clusters and manage those networks, again saving a fortune. We've got a low-cost cloud network with very few servers, data stored in the cloud. It works, it's cheap, it saves a fortune. And the network looks completely different in every school depending on what the head teacher wants, but the infrastructure behind it is in common. But these things require heads to work together and cede some autonomy to a central governing group. Support with central data, HR, and so on can all drive savings if the heads collaborate and agree to do it. In our case, the central body is the head teachers group who vote for the policies they want, and then we all follow them regardless of what particular individuals opted for. We work with a majority vote. And that back office is important because it gives you the resources for school improvement, which is what we're all here for. It's the school improvement. And we've predicted 12% budget cuts that Robert has shown us. That's a no-brainer. We've got to do it. But it's the school improvement that's key, and in my view, the best school improvement work can only be done at scale, generated by a school grouping. And there are many ways to skin a cat, a horrible analogy, because I love cats, but there are many ways to skin a cat. So, for example, working together, like many school groupings, we've created a team of central lead practitioners, expert teachers who coach and mentor staff in secondary in the EBAC subjects, in primary in maths, English and science, but most importantly, they go in and they take the classes. So if schools are missing a key member of staff for a key class, a really good teacher will go in and be responsible for those results, and those staff are shared across the group. That's what we can do if we can work together, and the kids get great outcomes because of it. And the schools pay with a smaller central charge than they ever paid when they're with the local authority. But it's not about academies. Any grouping of schools can do it. And central staff make a major contribution to the CPD and curriculum development of colleagues in schools because they've got the time to think about it. And they also run the bespoke programs that develop the next generation of middle leaders. Scale and collaboration with hard accountability allows all of that to happen more easily. Nurturing the next generation of great leaders is a huge issue. Groups of schools are best placed to create programs to do this. If existing leaders only have the vision to allow potential leaders to undertake a portfolio of activities, experience and placements designed to accelerate their development. This is something we do in our group with a tailor-made program for able middle leaders, assistant principals and deputies. Nobody wants their best staff out of school, but we've all agreed we need to take the short-term pain to produce the long-term gain. And as a single school, we couldn't do it. Our model is increasingly one of executive heads overseeing groups of 2 or 3 schools with less experienced newer colleagues being coached in, people who may not otherwise fly on their own, but with support for 2 or 3 years become great head teachers. It's easier in a group. So each of our schools collaborates very closely. They've all got a different curriculum, they've all got a different structure, depending on what works locally. But when things like a new national curriculum come along, it makes no sense for everyone to reinvent the wheel on their own. Think about the workload. So our teachers joined together to develop a system with standardised testing, replacing levels, and taking the best practitioners in each subject to get out of school and produce schemes of work that can be shared across. There are lots of possible solutions. Some of our schools didn't want to do it. That's great. They had that choice. They've seen it work. Now they all want to do it. So a school grouping also allows the development of internal educational audit teams who can provide member schools with much more detailed intelligence than an Ofsted report ever can, and allows participating colleagues to develop their expertise and improve their practice. So I can only commend the concept of school groupings, whatever format they take. If they're intelligent, that is, with hard accountability to ensure that the benefits of collective working are derived. But without that accountability, it's too easy for people to hide behind collaboration as a smokescreen for business as usual. Sure, enforced collaboration is necessary sometimes in extreme circumstances of failure, but as a general solution, enforced collaboration doesn't work. Thinking, for example, of the Byzantine levels of bureaucracy created in some places, I stress some places, with Every Child Matters or 14 to 19 diplomas. It's not about meetings for meetings' sake, it's about action for impact. And it's relatively easy, in my view, for all of us to do if those of us at the sharp end are the ones making it happen. Thank you very much.
So I had no idea what anybody else was going to say at the beginning of this. And I've been going through my list, ticking off all the points. So I am going to try and just say some things, partly to try to get some grit into the oyster. I'm going to start with Robert's presentation, if I may. And a general point, it seemed to me that there was an interesting disjunct between what were the drivers on the challenges, which were policy and funding, and the drivers on your opportunities, which were about professional capital. And I think one of the really big challenges for the next 5 years is going to be squaring the circle between the logic of the professional capital and where that takes you and the external pressures around money, around expectations and around capacity. I think that's going to be an interesting question. I'll come back to it at the very end. I think there are some, given that we're talking about the policy context shaped by the election, I think there are a couple of things that we can probably know as we look back. The first is that the future is not predictable. If we go back to 2010 and think about the things that shaped the last 5 years, some of them we might have predicted, but some of them we couldn't predict. Robert talked about the extent to which British values and combating extremism has come onto the agenda post-Birmingham. We didn't see that coming in 2010. So I think we can predict that the things that are going to be the most pressing, that will have the most impact, may very well be things that we cannot predict. And I think there's a general lesson for politicians, which is that for politicians, crises trump strategy. Harold Macmillan famously asked what was the most difficult thing about government, and he said, events, dear boy, events. It will be the unpredictable parts of the system that go wrong, that interact in different ways. I've got some money on the interaction between funding difficulties in 2016-17 and the sustainability of small sixth forms, causing vast amounts of difficulty that will make an awful lot of noise at the policy level. And I think there may be some issues that come in around the fact that early years funding on the manifesto is not protected, and set that against the 30-hour guarantee and the issue of the workforce. How those things interact, I think, are going to be very interesting. Some expectations, just developing that theme, we have a much more complex school system than we've had at any point in the past. A range of actors, new ones being introduced, maths developing. Performance of maths has been variable, some performing very strongly, some less so. Regional commissioners appearing in the system. And the story that's always told, I think it's quite a powerful analogy, is that experience that we all have from time to time in the shower. That you get into the shower and it's too hot. So you adjust the knob and nothing happens. So you turn it a bit more and it goes too cold because you can turn the knob more quickly than the shower can respond to the turning of the knob. And for politicians driven by the day-to-day, the temptation to turn the knob quicker and quicker in response to lack of system feedback or sometimes extreme system feedback is difficult. So what I think will happen over the next 5 years, I think the regional school commissioners will become increasingly significant. I think the fact that it is a long way, I speak out of sympathy for Sir David Carter, between Penzance and Bristol will become an ever more bigger problem. I think there will be deputy regional school commissioners. I think there will be an infrastructure around commissioners as they may be given more things to do, and that may be a really interesting point of tension as it emerges in the system. There will be an enormous pressure to get crises off the Secretary of State's desk and to get it onto somebody else's desk. It's one of the things that politicians do like to do. I think Russell said something really interesting. He said it tonight, and I saw him say it in a tweet the other day, that I think that the challenge for the next 5 years is capacity rather than... Did you say accountability or autonomy in the tweet? I'm sorry, Russell.
I couldn't fit them both in the tweet.
Right,
yes.
but it is capacity more important than accountability or autonomy. So I'm going to put in end with a shameless plug for the Institute of Education. I think that one of the challenges for any complex system is how you circulate knowledge around that system. The IOE is a knowledge brokering organisation. I'm delighted by the partnerships we have with a range of school groups, local authority and academy groups. We have a very good relationship with Harris, which I'm delighted by. I think that, and driven by a concern with research, with generating knowledge about practice, and I think that in a complex system that becomes all the more important. At root, the aspirations that I think are absolutely right in the Conservative Party manifesto for an excellent education for every child, for high expectations and outcomes for all, absolutely right. They cannot be delivered, whatever the system architecture, without a supply of good quality teachers. We all know that. It is going to be the big number, I think, that drives the system in the next few years. Thank you very much.